I trust everyone had a pleasant night. First order of business is all of my Vietnam brothers that were up here last night. Please see Carol sometime this morning. Question came up about Marion and the Dark of Night. And if you will go to the Naval Observatory website, you can punch in the dates that he fought at night, and I think you'll see the same interesting thing that I did, that he liked it dark. He was not a moonlight fighter, he was a dark and night fighter. You might be interested, you might not care, you might say that's silly, but what made me think about it was we found out that if there was no moon, we were going to be facing surface-to-air missiles when we went toward Hanoi. If it was over 85% illumination from the moon kind of night, then we were, in all probability, not going to have many missiles, but we were going to be looking for MiGs. And remembering that when I started reading about Marion fighting at night, I wondered if he played that kind of game. And sure enough, if you go back and look at the Naval Observatory Times, there was either no moon or it was a small moon that it set before he did his thing, or it had not risen yet. The business of flowers, the two largest things have already been set aside for a couple of our senior DAR members. However, all the small flower arrangements on the table are available if someone at that table would like to have them tonight after when we're ready to leave. Do not take the glass holders. We will have to check the sharpness of the swords out there if you try to leave with those. So there are plastic bags. Carol will help you find one. And we're going to do it very diplomatically. And we'll let the ladies at the table sort out which one is the senior, and they get the first dibs on it. Is that fair or is that fair? That's really tap dancing around, isn't it? We're happy to say that we, Carol and I, have been relieved of having to reproduce the DVDs. Nancy Cave is taking it over for the archives and raising money for the archives by reproducing and selling the DVDs. So if you wish to have a DVD of this year's show, see her. She's got all of the years that we made DVDs on file there, and she'll put them together in a very nice presentation kind of folder. And anyway, Nancy's the lady that signed me in, if you forgot. As you leave, if you do not need this plastic name tag holder for a souvenir, we would wish that you put it in the bronze temple bowl on the way out. It's on your left-hand side on the table. The same goes for the plastic holders for your paperwork and everything. If you are happy to just carry the paperwork away by itself, that would be nice. But if you'd like to have the folder for something else at home, go ahead and take it. And for anybody that just arrived today and hasn't been before, you'll find the restrooms. If you go out this door, turn right. When you get to the big hall, go either left or right, and you'll find the appropriate women's or men's rooms. Any other questions this morning? Okay. As those that have been here know, I don't read you the bios. I think you all can read them. You can read it ahead of time and know what a great speaker is coming. And we have a really great start here. Unfortunately, Al succumbed to the constant badgering of Carol. He wasn't going to do it, then I don't know how many weeks later, well, I might be able to do it. And then he finally agreed to do it. And I've looked over what he's got for you this morning, and I think you're going to be very impressed by his presentation on the French Huguenots. Al?
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
When France opened its veins, we're going to scratch the surface. And after I have finished this presentation, do I have my mic? Got the mic? Okay. Good. After I finished this presentation, I want to do an inventory to see how many Huguenots there are here this morning. Direct Huguenot background. I've already discovered 4 or 5, so we're going to do a Huguenot inventory a little later. This is the way the paper unfolds. We're going to look first of all at 3 royal edicts in France, then the Huguenot migration to America, and more specifically to South Carolina. We're going to look at early Huguenot influence upon South Carolina. Then, briefly, the Huguenot settlements in South Carolina. The Huguenot churches in South Carolina. And finally, we'll take a look at the Marian Huguenots. So we'll begin in France, make our way to the Carolina colony, and eventually to the Marians. In important ways, theologically conservative Catholics and Protestants are now more similar to each other than they are to their liberal counterparts. But that was not true in the aftermath of the 16th century Protestant Reformation. Early efforts to achieve reconciliation failed, and the 2 branches of Christianity largely settled into long-term conflict. The European Wars of Religion, 1524, 1648 resulted. Nowhere was that conflict more bitter than in France, where the Reformation gave birth to a body of Protestants known as Huguenots, and where conflict produced massive Huguenot exodus. The British colony of South Carolina became a major beneficiary. The Huguenots were part of the Reformed wing of Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation. Reformed theology owes its origin chiefly to John Calvin, who was himself a Frenchman. His dates 1509, 1564. He lived, pastored, wrote, and led from Geneva. Reformed theology may be cautiously referred to as Calvinism. 3 royal edicts provide a frame of reference for the Huguenot exodus. First, the Edict of Nantes, 1598. Second, the Edict of Fontainebleau, 1685. And the Edict of Toleration, 1787. The first 2 edicts are the ones that concern us here. The French Wars of Religion, 1562, 1598, and the August 24-25, 1572 St. Bartholomew's massacre of Huguenots form part of the context for the royal edicts. First of all, let's give attention to the Edict of Nantes, 1598. The Edict of Nantes was issued by Henry IV of France. Before becoming king, he had been a Huguenot leader. To gain the crown,
Henry became a Catholic. But even after becoming king, Henry remained sympathetic to Protestants. The goal of Nantes was restoration of civil order. It established a 100-year religious truce, which supposedly settled past Protestant Catholic grievances. It really did not. The edict freed Protestant prisoners and gave them substantial rights and protection. Nantes defended Protestantism, Protestant freedom of conscience, granted them access to education, and established a court composed of Catholics and Protestants to resolve religious conflict. The edict restored Catholic control where Catholic practice had been interrupted and permitted Protestants to conduct public worship in many parts of the country, Paris excepted. Most Catholic priests and the Catholic majority resented Nantes. Now turn to the Edict of Fontainebleau, 1685. October the 18th, 1685, Louis the 14th issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, which revoked the Edict of Nantes. It is also known as the Edict of Revocation. Even before this edict was issued, the Edict of Nantes had largely become a dead letter in France, as witnessed by intense persecution of Huguenots in parts of France. Many Huguenot families had converted, and I have in parentheses, nominally with the question mark, had converted to Catholicism, and many had fled. By 1685, Huguenots represented less than 5% of the French population. Before issuing the Edict of Fontainebleau, Louis XIV had gradually shredded the Edict of Nantes by restricting Huguenots from most trades. Protestant churches were torn down one by one. The violent dragonnades, which were policies of intimidation, forced Protestants to recant in droves. Approximately 550,000 recanted. Many who refused to convert were imprisoned. Protestant schools were banned, and Protestant children were forcibly baptized and educated as Catholics. Protestant pastors who refused to convert were banished. Fearing a mass exodus of Huguenots, further exodus was banned on pain of imprisonment for women and the galley for men. If fleeing Huguenots refused to return, their property was confiscated. New converts to Protestantism were to be punished. Beginning in 1686, children of Protestant families between the ages of 5 and 16 were to be placed in the custody of Catholic parents or any court-appointed person, Catholic to be sure. From a population of approximately 750,000 Huguenots in 1685, nearly 200,000 fled, about 2,500 were imprisoned or sent to convents or deported to the West Indies or executed or sent to the galleys. Walter Edward quotes one of the escaping immigrants. After suffering months of abuse by French soldiers, in 1685, Judith Gritton Manigault and her family, quote, resolved on quitting France. We continued to hide for 10 days while a search was made for us. The family escaped by way of the Huguenot Underground Railroad. First made their way to England and then eventually to South Carolina. The Edict of Toleration comes in 1787. That's the third edict. It comes late, and it really doesn't affect our consideration here. Now let's turn more narrowly to the Huguenot migration in America, or to America. In 1562, the Huguenot explorer John Ribault founded the ill-fated Charles Fort colony in what was then Terra, Florida. The settlement was located on what is now Parris Island, South Carolina, where the Ribault Monument stands. But that effort really doesn't affect the large-scale migration to South Carolina. So, the great bulk of French immigration to the American colonies occurred after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. No more than 2,000 refugees arrived before 1700. 500 to 600 of these came to Carolina. Slightly more than 1,000 arrived in South Carolina between 1680 and 1775. The peak of the migration occurred between 1684 and 1690. During the entire 18th century, approximately 4,000 came to North America. Not all immigrants were French, but were with French names. Some were Swiss. The first migrations to South Carolina is the most important. It occurred between 1680 and 1700, when Carolina was controlled by the Lords Proprietors. 1663, 1729 are the inclusive dates for proprietary ownership of the colony. 1663, 1729. Migration was encouraged for benevolent and economic reasons. The proprietors wanted to settle the region for the lowest possible cost, and also to encourage production that would support lucrative trade. One catalyst for the French Protestant immigration to America was the 1662 British Act of Uniformity. It required strict adherence to the Church of England for holding government and church offices. Another catalyst was intense competition for employment, exacerbated by French immigration to England. By sending Huguenots to America, the English hoped to retain these efficient folk while also expelling them. So, Christian benevolence teamed with economic motives. In response to the proprietors' desire to attract religious dissenters from England, during the spring of 1680, the British Crown provided the frigate HMS Richmond to transport a few dozen Huguenots to Charleston. These 45 persons were the first Huguenots to arrive in significant number. They were attracted by the promise of religious and political freedom and the availability of land. Some Huguenots remained in Charleston, but most of them moved north and east along the eastern branch of the Cooper River. Then they expanded to what was at that time South Carolina's northern frontier, the Santee River, also known as French Santee. Along the Santee, they became successful planters, creating one of the colony's richest rice-growing enterprises. Now, promotional literature, proprietary promotional literature, promised to French-speaking Protestants an Edenic image of La Caroline, as the settlements were known. However, in France, colonial life in America was predominantly viewed as crude and dangerous. South Carolina was somewhat accurately perceived as a remote and isolated land inhabited by Indians, alligators, and snakes. Of the 14 locations in British North America where significant numbers of Huguenots settled, 6 were in South Carolina. In terms of percentage ratio, South Carolina had the largest French population among the 13 colonies. New York received the largest total number, just the raw number. Now let's turn even more pointedly to Huguenot influence in South Carolina. By rejecting its Huguenots, France deprived itself of people with remarkable economic ability. Their skills included vine dressers, weavers, wheelwrights, saddlers, hat makers, coopers, leather dressers, carpenters, gunsmiths, and workers in brass, gold, and silver. There were also silk and cocoon specialists. There were planters. There were apothecaries. There were blacksmiths. They represented France's strength in agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce. As a result of persecution, Huguenots were hardened against labor, hardened against fatigue, and against privation. All of this was raw material needed for successful colonization. The South Carolina proprietors had hoped the French Protestants would turn the colony into a successful agricultural experimental station. So initially, Huguenots came to Carolina intending to produce commodities that were staples in France. That plan soon ran aground because products easily obtained in England and France were not really suited for the South Carolina or Carolina soil and climate. Now, throughout the proprietary period, Huguenots exercised significant influence over the colony's political, religious, and socioeconomic development. Esther Hoskins describes the Huguenots as social yeast. They were second only to the English as the most important ethnic group in South Carolina. Their influence was out of proportion to their numbers. South Carolina historian David Duncan Wallace says the Huguenot immigrants exercised an influence beyond their proportional numbers. By the skill of his agriculture, the deftness of his hand, his reverence for family solidarity, the large success of his business, the soundness of his public views, and the integrity of his character, the Huguenot added one of the most beneficent elements of our life. Though occasionally reminded during the first generation of being merely a tolerated Frenchman, Huguenots conquered narrowness and prejudice by native worth, discretion, and forbearance. That was predominantly their character. Walter Edgar says that until about 1720, the Huguenots married within the Huguenot community and continued to speak and write French. Afterwards, they began to intermarry with the with the English majority, joined the Church of England, and made, according to Edgar, little effort to perpetuate the remembrance of a distinct nationality. Unlike the numerous dissenting Presbyterians, the Huguenots accepted the advantage of joining the Church of England. Doing so released them from the financial burden of supporting their own clergy. The Naturalization Act of March 1697 in South Carolina accelerated Huguenot assimilation. But, as Walter Edgar observes, assimilation did not come easy for the Huguenots. They were often the object of intense ethnic animosity. Materially, Huguenots increased the aggregate wealth of the province. The European phrase, rich as a Huguenot, justifiably took root in South Carolina. Aside from merchandise and trade, the basis of Huguenot wealth lay in land and slaves that steadily appreciated in value. Add to that wealth of Indian slaves and white indentured servants, and you have the wealth of the Huguenots. However, Huguenot fortitude should not be equated with material wealth. Many were so poor they needed British material assistance. Nevertheless, the thrifty Huguenots labored almost unceasingly to build up their wealth. Arthur Hirsch says that in 1685, the Huguenot, as a rule, owned a little hut, log-hewn, crude, and primitive. By 1735, his home was, as a rule, crowded with comforts. In addition, there were frequently many luxuries. If we have time, I want to come back and provide for you Max Weber's theological or sociological explanation for the relationship between Huguenot Calvinism and Huguenot material success. We'll see if we have time for that. I find it intriguing. The Huguenot settlements in South Carolina. The Huguenots established 8 settlements in South Carolina. 6 were in or near Charleston. Charlestown, French Santee, St. James Goose Creek, St. Thomas and St. Denis, also known as Orange Quarter and French Quarter, St. John's Berkeley, St. Stephen's. That's 6. Add to those Pearisburg in the extreme south, which did not succeed, and New Bordeaux in the backcountry, and you have the 8. I want to concentrate just on those settlements that relate directly to Berkeley County, what became Berkeley County. First of all, French Santee. The largest Huguenot settlement outside Charlestown during the early life of the colony was St. James Santee, located on or near the Santee River. It was established by a small scouting party that sailed up the Santee in January 1687. In this area, the refugees settled on plantations where they cultivated vineyards, olives, and silkworms. They also produced naval stores. By 1690, approximately 80 French families had settled there. Jamestown, located in present-day northeastern Berkeley County, was the principal population center and the settlement's only town. It was largely abandoned as an urban center long before 1764. St. James Goose Creek. Early in the colony's life, Goose Creek became a favorite residential site for Charlestown people. Land was granted to Huguenots as early as 1680. French and English settlers were attracted to the area's rich lands. By 1694, Goose Creek had become a rather large settlement. French families lived either on plantations or in fashionable country homes. The next settlement, St. Thomas and St. Denis. This is a bit tricky.
also known as Orange Quarter. The Church Act of 1706, in which the Church of England became the established church in South Carolina, divided the colony into 10 parishes. And if we can get that particular slide, back one. It's okay. When it pops up, you'll see it. 10 parishes. The peninsula, here we go. The peninsula formed by the Cooper River and Wando Rivers, located today in Berkeley County, was organized as St. Thomas Parish to serve the English-speaking majority. But to serve the Huguenots in the area, a parish within a parish was created. Its name was St. Denis, the patron saint of France. Other than the portion of this area associated with the local Huguenot church, not much is known about the French settlement, or Orange Quarter or French Quarter. The Huguenot settlements extended from Quimby Creek, and I see this spelled Quimby and Quimby, so I'm not sure which one it is. Quimby Creek southward, principally on French Quarter Creek. No town was established here. By the mid-18th century, intermingling and intermarriage had made the English and French one and the same people. Consequently, 1784, St. Denis Parish was merged into St. Thomas Parish. Now let's come to St. John's, Berkeley. St. John's, Berkeley settlement. The Huguenot settlement of St. John's, Berkeley, as it was known after 1706, was the child of the Orange Quarter and the Santee sections. It was located near the fertile banks of the Cooper River, 30 miles nearer Charlestown than the Santee region. A more favorable place in which to live, it had a better quality of high land than the pine forests and swamplands of the Santee district. The colony was founded by Dr. Anthony Cordes, and I see this name pronounced Cordes and Cordes, so I'm not altogether certain which one is preferable. Dr. Anthony Cordes, a medical doctor, along with 10 Huguenot families. Dr. Cordes arrived in Charlestown in 1686. Great plantations were made where stock raising became a leading industry. Prominent Huguenot family names for St. John, Berkeley included Joseph St. Julian, Isaac Mazik, Rene Ravenel, and Henry Lawrence, who became famous as a statesman prior to and during the American Revolution. Arthur Hirsch, who is sort of the premier authority on Huguenots in South Carolina. Arthur Hirsch provides a summary of Huguenot life in St. John's, Berkeley. The Huguenots of this parish were principally planters. A life of exceptional freedom and comfort was theirs. Their parlors were rich with mirrors, drapery, elegant furniture, and silverware. Their libraries contained the best books. Here, amid the gardens, where the primitive trees of the original forest survived in all their original glory, stood the homes of these rich Huguenot planters. One can almost see, even at this distance, the beautiful landscape presented by noble houses, clustered closely about with trees and stately terraces, and back behind the skies of beautiful blue. Would you want to live there? Now, St. Stephen's, finally. Considered the garden spot of South Carolina, 1754, St. Stephen's Parish was created by immigration from the parish of St. James Santee. Long before that, it was the residence of numerous French families. One benefit was that the land was not subject
to the sudden and frequent flooding common along the Santee. Its fertile soil induced the French of St. James Santee, some of them at least, to leave their homes in exchange for a place congenial to the growth of indigo, the chief source of their expanding wealth. Before long, St. Stephen's Parish became the most thickly populated rural area in the province. Magnificent Milford Plantation, located west of Pinewood in current South Carolina, is an example. Prominent families and plantations of St. Stephen's included the Porchers on Plantation, Mexico, located on the Santee, the Marions at Belle Isle Plantation in current Berkeley County. Other prominent Huguenot names were Peter Courtier, the DeBoses, the Rich Wards, the Sicklers, and the Cords. And the list just goes on. No Huguenot church was maintained there after 1706. The French Protestants became members, officers of the established church. The two that we will not deal with here, Perrysburg and the backcountry. We're not going to deal either with the Huguenot churches in South Carolina, but just to say that during the early and mid-1900s, the Huguenot Society of South Carolina erected 5 granite crosses to mark the original sites of Huguenot settlements and Huguenot churches, located on 1-acre plots known as God's Acre. The crosses are located in Goose Creek, Orange or French Quarter, French Santee, Perrysburg, and New Bordeaux. That's 5. A 6th cross is located at the Huguenot Church in Charleston. Esther and I visited the ruins of St. John's Berkeley Parish Church, close to Monk's Corner. And that's the biggest church, and apparently the Huguenots merged into that congregation. That church, the independent church of the Huguenots, ceased to exist. Now, I want to turn for just a moment to the Marian Huguenots. Among the Huguenot emigres and names, Marian figures prominently. Admittedly, Marian doesn't immediately sound like a French name, does it? You're supposed to say you're correct. But indeed it was. I want to engage in a bit of etymology here, okay? Some sources say that in medieval France, Marian meant a devotee of the Virgin Mary. Other sources say the name means Star of the East. The first meaning seems most reliable for the Carolina Marian Huguenots. I think that the Star of the East is not the one that applies here. The first meaning seems to be most reliable. Now, the word Marian derives from the Hebrew name Miriam, that Old Testament figure, the sister of whom? Good. The English word Mary derives from the Latin word Maria, which in turn derives from the Greek names Mariam, okay? Ending with the Greek letters mu, and Maria, anglicized as Mary. Now, take Mariam, change the second alpha in Mariam to an omicron, and the mu to a mu, and you have Mary. Originally a devotee of the Virgin Mary. Irony of ironies. If this etymology is correct, You have Huguenots who despise the French with a name that means a devotee of the Virgin Mary. History has its humor. Benjamin Marion was the grandfather of Francis Marion. He left France in 1685, perhaps after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. When Benjamin left France, he was married to Judith Ballou. Records show that others, at least 9, came with him. Benjamin and Judith must have arrived in South Carolina between February the 6th, 1692, 1693, and March 13, 1693, 1694. And you say to yourself, which? 2 different year identifications. Well, the uncertainty derived from how Governor Thomas Smith recorded his grant of land to Benjamin Marion. I'll quote the governor. Given under my hand and sealed this 13th day of March, the year of our Lord, 1693, 1694. Benjamin was awarded 350 acres in St. James Parish. Now, 10 children were born to Benjamin and Judith, all of them with biblical names. Gabriel, the youngest son, married Esther Cordes, a daughter of Dr. Anthony Cordes, who was himself born in France, and I don't know when he left France. So was his wife was also born in France. I just don't know about when they left. Now, to Gabriel and Esther Marion were born 7 children. Francis Marion was the youngest. Francis was born, as you probably already know, at his family plantation, Goatfield, in the current Cordsville area of Berkeley County, probably in 1732. After the Revolutionary War, on April the 20th, 1786, Francis married his cousin, Mary Esther Vidot. And I know what you're thinking. Boy, these names seem to be very closely related in marriages, and they were. She was charming, of stellar character, and wealthy. Like Francis, Mary Esther was of Huguenot descent. She was the daughter of Henry Joseph Vidot and Anne Cordes,